Welcome to the See You Try show. I am really fortunate today to have Reverend Caplow with us for the show. And just a reminder, the See You Try show, we're really focusing on trauma and resiliency, and hope is such a fundamental part of resiliency. So I'm hoping we'll have sort of this open conversation. Just a reminder, the Trauma and Resiliency initiative gets funding from the Mental Health Board and the City of Champaign and the Community Coalition. So we're really fortunate, but also the views and the opinions of the guests are always their own. And so that we can have this free and open conversation. So we've had like a conversation before the conversation. So excuse us. Reverend Caplow was going to be with us last time we had the show, and instead Pastor Thomas and I had a conversation. So I shared with her that she'll have to pick up where we left off, but I am so happy to have this conversation with you. So welcome. And you mentioned that you had a poem to get us started, so I am all open.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I feel like it's part of an ongoing conversation between the two of us that we can share with others. And it's always an honor to speak with you, truly. Yes, you know, you're one of my heroes. So yeah, I'd love to
mutual admiration, I gotta just tell you, right?
I'd like to start with this poem. As I was thinking about today, there's a poem that I have loved for a long time that is by an Irish-American poet whose name is David White. And it's about faith, but I think actually you could very easily substitute hope in where he says faith. And I just love the imagery, and I feel like it's very, it actually fits with what's been happening for us in the last few days. So I'll just read it.
Okay.
I want to write about faith, about the way the moon rises over cold snow night after night. Faithful even as it fades from fullness, slowly becoming that last curving and impossible sliver of light before the final darkness. But I have no faith myself. I refuse it, even the smallest entry. Let this then, my small poem, like a new moon, slender and barely open, be the first prayer that opens me to faith.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, we've actually had a beautiful full moon over cold snow night after night. But I love that imagery, and just I think about this a lot actually with sunrises too, that, you know, the sun is rising even when we can't see it because it's hidden by clouds, or, you know, that there are these deep constants that we can be supported by, even if at times we're kind of closed off from the direct experience.
Yes.
And to me, that's part of what hope and faith are about.
Yeah. And so I agree with you. I think faith and hope are words that sometimes most of the time can be used interchangeably. There's sort of a bi-directional, right, piece, right? In some ways, faith is the verb part of hope, right? Like it's the how you do it. And I love the poem. It was perfect. So, right, the conversation was starting or generated because, right, we were meeting right after January 6th and trying to think about the impact of that on people, heart, mind, soul, spirit, and just the role of hope in the middle of activism and pain. And I know for me, I will tell you, I talk about my mom a lot, but I mentioned this last time. On the day after January 6th, my mom said she just got absolutely depressed, and she wasn't sure why, but she said she couldn't sleep, and she just felt just the sheer amount of despondency. And I don't know if I should mention her name, but someone reached out to us and asked us to put together like an information sheet, one of the local community leaders, and said, hey, the residents in my neighborhood are just absolutely just don't know how to make sense or how to language what happened. And I was like, somehow we've got to elevate conversations about language about what happened, but also to keep inspiring hope, because in the middle of like, right, for people who've been fighting for social change and activism, believing in a world, for a lot of people, right, January 6th was a heartbreak. So that was my monologue to say, hey, let's talk about this. How have you, or how have you, right, like how have the people that you work with and support, or even you personally, how were you impacted by January 6th?
Well, I think heartbreak is the word. I think January 6th is going to be one of those days like 9/11 where we're all going to remember what we were doing at when we heard, how we heard, what we saw. The images are kind of seared on my mind. Actually, I didn't have access to a television on 9/11, so those images are very abstract for me. The images for January 6th are brutally there in me. I was working at home and my mother was with me. And I think actually it started with someone saying, go texting me, go online, see what's happening. And I wept. I mean, over and over again. And I know that in a way, it felt like the trauma of the last 4 years. I was serving a congregation in 2016, a different congregation when the election happened. And it was in a very, very progressive community. And people were walking around like they had just been in a huge car wreck.
Yeah.
There were people embracing each other in tears, on the street, strangers. We were having daily meetings in our church because people were filled with such dread and fear. And in a way, January 6th was kind of the full circle of, yes, this is exactly why people were so afraid.
Yeah.
And then, to go from that to the inauguration 2 weeks later, I think, I don't know how it is for other people, but I know for me, I just felt like, oh my goodness, I don't even like using this language, but it's the language that kind of comes up for me. We dodged so many bullets to be able to get to that inauguration. The election, the post-election time, January 6th, everyone, so many people, from the states on up, choosing to act from integrity. Even in the face of death threats, I think, and this kind of gets back to hope, I think. So I think that we have to look this right in the eye. We can't turn away from it. We can't normalize it. And we've been kind of put in this position of normalizing over the last 4 years. And I think January 6th was kind of like, oh, we are so far from normal, right? And yet still those energies of normalizing are there. So this combination of really looking like this is America. This is America. This is, I talk about in my church about how we're like a house on a foundation that was built on slavery and genocide. And that foundation, until you address the foundation, the house is not, cannot ultimately be fully whole, right?
Yeah.
And that in a way that it's like we're seeing the foundation, we're seeing the how that foundation that is so broken, is enacted in people's behaviors and hearts. And so there's that. But then there's also, like, right alongside it, like this, again, this way that so many people are expressing courage.
Mhm.
I lived in Washington State before I was here. There's a Republican congresswoman in the district where I lived, a kind of rural district in southwestern Washington, who, I mean, she's a Tea Party candidate. I mean, she's just a total, remember the Tea Party? That seemed really radical when that happened. Um, and and yet she was one of the 10 people who voted to the 10 Republicans who voted for impeachment.
Yeah.
And I mean, the Patriot Front, I think, is right in her district. The courage that took to do that, and I, this is the piece around hope for me, is that no matter what is happening, there is this way that, human courage and greatness and love and truth shows up over and over again, even at the times when, you can't see the moon or the sun or anything, it's still there.
So that's in some ways a perfect segue and something that I've been sort of struggling with. So I love the reflection on courage in the midst, right? And I'm with you. I think so many people saw the inauguration as sort of wiping out the six, and that is both the good news and the bad news. It's in some ways how we got here, right? Is that our desire to move to sort of magic slate, or I don't know if you remember the little etch-a-sketches, right? Like you draw a picture, you shake it up, and then like presto magic, it's all pretty again.
Right.
Is in part how we got here, right? And I'm misquoting him, but Biden said at the memorial the day before the election, right? The COVID, that we have to reflect, we have to see, we have to remember before we can move on and heal. And it's what you were saying, like, I think we don't want to remember our full truth with all of the complexities and what and I'm going to say something that Pastor Thomas pushed back on a little bit, but I think across the board, when I saw the six, it was heartbreak for our country, but I also think about what has been lost. Welcome to the See You Try show. I am really, really fortunate today to have six with rage and anger and fear and hatred, how you got here, right? And that for me was also the heartbreak, right? And what hasn't been remembered that creates just that sheer amount of disconnect, right? Where there's an us and a them, and right, where there are folks who really feel in their core marginalized and silenced and not heard and not seen, and right, and like, how do you get there in a world of opportunity and plenty, right? And so I have been struggling, right, with the, both, I don't want to do even victim and offender, or, guilty and innocent, but like on both sides of the continuum, like for me, the heartbreak was, gosh, there are that many people who really could get so right inspired by rage against other people that they just weren't able to see the humanity. And so how do we speak to that in this moment, right, where we both have accountability in love, right, and to see what does this moment require?
Yeah, and I think it's a tough question. I've been really intrigued by the work of a psychologist who wrote a book about Trump in 2017.
Okay.
And then is actually just another one was just released. She's been interviewed a couple of times by Bill Moyer and, you know, in some other areas. And one of the things that she said that I just thought was so insightful is that if you have a person in a family who is seriously mentally ill, that obviously other vulnerable members of the family are vulnerable to that mental illness, but so are healthy people. So are people who are not intrinsically mentally ill in the family.
Wow.
And that, especially if that person is in a power position in the family. And of course, you know, a president is in an extraordinarily powerful position. And also we know we have incredibly high rates of mental illness in our country, right? Incredibly high rates across all, you know, demographics. And so that means that people are vulnerable to propaganda,
Right, you're gonna have to repeat it because there was a
yeah,
little
we
lag.
froze. Yeah.
Yeah.
People are vulnerable to propaganda, and people who are, you know, whether they're diagnosed or not, but might be struggling to some degree with mental illness, are more vulnerable. And, you know, people underestimate the power of propaganda. I mean, it is, it's a very finely honed art that is used all over the world, and it can make people do things that they would never imagine that they would do.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's just a recent article that came out that was pointing out that this is not just a far right phenomenon. It's actually happening on the left as well.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And so part of what I feel is, you know, and I don't have anyone in my life who's kind of gone down the rabbit hole into intense conspiracy theories. But my sense is that where there's the greatest possibility of conversation is with people that are kind of, you know, not too far from where you are.
Yeah.
And the farther they are, and the more they have kind of gone into an alternate truth world, the less likely it is to be able to actually have real conversation. And there are certainly people in my congregation who are really called to do that work. Personally, I am called to strengthening and you know, giving hope and courage to people who are committed to facing this and to continuing to do the incredibly important work that we need to do, not being derailed by the fear, by the threats, by the violence, but just saying, no, we are going forward, you know. Of course, you know, the inauguration poem that just,
Amanda
you know,
Corwin, yeah.
Oh my goodness, right? And that, you know, everybody knows this who studies social change. The violence increases as you get closer to real social change, the change back violence. You know, as women become more emancipated in India, the violence against women increases, right? You can say, oh, well, you know, given that, I'm just going to put my head down. Or you can say, wow, we must be doing pretty well. Let's, you know, let's link hands, link arms, and keep going.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So those are all great things. So I wasn't familiar with the book. So I wonder if her hypothesis is right. Because I'm always interested, right? Like I think for the audience, right, when we think about mental illness, people have a conceptualization. And I like to think about mental illness in the same way that we think about physical illness, like the absence of wellness, right? So that there are folks who have experienced both individual traumas, right? Like the things that have happened to them, but also I'm in deep study around collective trauma and really thinking about the impact of all of the silences and the secrets and the giving up culture and the giving up identity and things that grounded you, that so many folks who are white, right? Like all the research around whiteness and right, like I know that there's some politicking around that, but if you think about what it means to sort of buy into a notion of that you were going to be given access, you weren't going to struggle, and you were always going to feel like you had power over, you always were going to get first choice, and then you show up and more people get right, you feel like you're losing because we've set this up as this binary choice between people who have and people who haven't, and we act like there's only a few people who can have, and so people feel like, oh my gosh, I've got to like fight to keep people out. And then we've also demonized people, right? So all of those things. And then you look at communities that have been ravaged by the opioid epidemic, or, people who thought that they were going to retire and companies, shut down and took their benefits. And now they're like working 2 jobs, and they thought that they were going to, they thought there was going to be promises about what the life, and then we hadn't promoted wellness, right? Which is balance and connection and community and faith and hope and self-care and, eating well, and right. They were, so people were having culture and having things that ground you. And then you can easily tap into the unwell, right? Where you don't feel connected, and you don't feel safe, and you don't engage in good behavior being like, consume things that are nurturing and fulfilling, right? And resiliency making. Instead, you get further and further away from wellness. And so I could see her argument around folks who can be vulnerable in those key ways and seem mentally unwell. I don't know if I shared this with you, but so the seminary I went to is the same seminary that Jim Jones graduated from. So when I went, we had to go through a battery of mental health. Like I did not know that my seminary was the one that Jim Jones had attended, but we took like the MMPI and a bunch of personality assessments, and I was like, why would we have to take like all of this, right? And then I realized like they're trying to make sure another Jim Jones doesn't come through, right?
Well, actually, for what it's worth, I had to do all of those too. They really are, there's a general concern, clergy this is kind of my point, that when people are powerful in some way, clergy, politicians, whatever, they can do enormous damage.
Right.
Out of their own wounding, their own, whatever might be going on in their personality structure. Yeah.
And it's why I think, right, we need accountability for leadership and
right.
support and a whole bunch of things, because you're right, people who are leading and bleeding can do horrific things. The caveat to this is my mom believes that one of her really close friends from college that she lost contact with, that was from the West Indies, he was going through huge sort of emotional transition, probably died in the Jim Jones massacre. And that has always sort of stayed with me around people's subjectivity, right, to propaganda and conspiracy, and how at any moment, right, where you aren't fortified and connected and supported and those kinds of things, can find this, charismatic figure and, and be drawn to that at the cost of self. So,
right.
So I've always had a heart place for that way. And I'm also struggling with, as Reverend Thomas reminded me, the accountability. He said, Reverend Thomas said, hey, yes, you can have a love ethic once there's some repentance. And I was like, but I don't know how we get to repentance without love. Like, how do we figure out like that balance of the two? Because I don't know if I demonize folks, right, who've gone down that rabbit hole, if we can return to love. And I don't know how, so yeah, help me sort that out. All right. So I've always been sort of, like you said, like there are people who are called to try to sort of say, let's try to have this relational piece around healing, because I don't want it to be us and them, right? I'm going to say one more thing. My sister, the day after the election, and we were anticipating this, right? So it looked like the former president had won. And my sister said, she called me up in tears. She's older than I am. She's in Virginia. And she's like, my neighbor put up a flag of the former president, and a woman who was a bridesmaid in her wedding started posting like, hey, we won things on Facebook. And she's like, I've known these people for 40 years. And she was like devastated. Like, she was like, I don't know how I like go and wave at my neighbor, and I don't know what to think about my sister, my bridesmaid, because she's like, I thought we were like more aligned. And she's like, I don't know how we stay in relationship. And I was, and I've been in that place, right, where how do we maintain these relationships where now it feels like anywhere you could look could be an adversary, right? Like somebody who doesn't value your humanity. So how do we maintain love, right?
Those are really profound and deeply spiritual and emotional and relevant questions for this time. I'm really, bringing back Jim Jones, and, younger people probably don't even necessarily know that history, but, it was a mass suicide. And actually, when I was in the Bay Area and in seminary, I also met people who had, Jim Jones was a, respected and sort of charismatic Black religious leader.
Yeah.
So, and, we don't demonize the people who died, right? From in the Jim Jones suicide. I certainly don't. I think most people are just like, oh, and I think to remember that it could be us. Yeah. We are not immune. We need to do the work inside to stay grounded, to watch our own tendencies to make enemies, to believe stories, to believe the authority figures around us, and to to watch for the forces of hatred in our own hearts, right? That's I'm just going to tell this story because it moves me every time I think about it. Right after the election, 2016, our church, again in this small town in Washington, had a vigil the very next day. And there was a young man who was in the town, not a member of the church, but he heard that we were doing this vigil. We put it out on Facebook. And he actually stood with a sign in front of the food co-op saying, the UU Church is having a vigil tonight. He really, really wanted people to know about it. And a lot of people came, and we gave space for people to stand up and speak. And he stood up and he said, now this kind of speaks to what Pastor Thomas was talking about. He stood up and he said, I was a huge supporter of Bernie Sanders. I actually went down to California and worked as one of the organizers on his campaign. And I fed hatred of Hillary Clinton.
Wow.
I fed hatred. I really didn't think she was going to lose the election, but I am part of what made that possible. Wow. I fed hatred, and I vowed to never do it again. And I was just so blown away, because there was so much truth and so much true remorse. That's why he was determined, that vigil was going to happen, because he needed to say that out loud. And I don't know, have you heard of the Rita Nakashima Brock and Rebecca Parker wrote a book called Moral Injury about the about the effect, especially on military people, of being given orders, to do actions that ultimately really harm their spirit. And I wonder, you think about people that have gotten caught up in other kind of propaganda, whether it's, the Rwandan massacres or what happened in Serbia and, other places, that the moral injury, at some point, a lot of people do kind of wake up. And then they're faced with the moral injury that they're carrying.
Yeah. Yes.
And that's hard to face. I mean, that young man is to me a very unusual person to be able to pivot and like fully acknowledge how he had fed hatred.
Yeah.
But that's a big job, and I think that's something we all have to watch
Yeah.
and help each other, like if it's happening, to not. I mean, there are people who want a civil war in this country. They're clear about this. So how are we, as people who do not want a civil war, how are we called to act?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Yes. And right. And I also wonder how much historical moral injury
Oh,
has
yes. Let's talk
has
about
played
historical
a
moral
role
injury.
in
Yeah. Yeah.
desire, right? Well, so that the lack of wanting to deal with the consequences of being a part of, groups, classes of people who have caused harm. So you just disown that part of yourself and you pretend like it didn't exist. And I think so, right, we could go down the rabbit hole, but I wonder, right, when we look at vulnerabilities for substance abuse and addictions and those kinds of things, what we don't deal with shows up in our lives, right? And so when we have to sort of self-medicate rather than address, you need to numb and self-soothe and do all kinds of things because we're not telling the truth. And so I believe it's easier to be angry and enraged than to grieve and mourn and feel lament. In some ways, I believe as a country, we'd be in a different place if we spent a year this next year in lamentation, right? Like I
Yes.
feel like we
Yes.
just need a period of lament, right? Deep
Weeping.
lament, because there's,
Yeah.
so I'm going to say something that's going to sound a little political, but I think, and then I want to go back to hope because I want to end on a note, but I think anytime when you have up to 500,000 deaths, right? And that we really don't, as people, as communities, as individuals, right? Like really acknowledge what that means. And most of those are people of color or low wealth people, right? Like, and so we're not really even acknowledging just the impact of that. I think every day, even people who are allies might find themselves doing things that are going to leave them feeling a little conflicted, right? So I have a daughter who's a teacher in DC, so she's not here locally. And we were talking about the mixed messages in some ways around knowing that we have new variant strains of the virus and then saying that it's okay to open up schools, right? Like it seems like it's like a very disconnect, and people who are making those decisions, who I think are well intended, if there are unintended consequences, will have to live with the weight of that, right? And rather than us as communities of people who are connected to each other advocating for a wage that allows people to stay at home, and forget $2,000 twice a year, like literally we should be doing whatever it takes to get business open and people who can stay home, and equipping that, and then helping people who are from marginalized communities and students feel connected to each other. And there are all kinds of innovative, creative ways that we could invest in people. We're saying, let's go back to like some semblance of normal that make us at risk, right? Like that don't, like that cognitive dissonance, that are going to leave our hearts like wounded, or we're going to just kind of pretend like it didn't happen. We're going to be like, yes, I know we put a whole bunch of like, I mean, right, because the kids that people that they're most worried about, right, are poor, Black, and low income, are the ones who are most likely to have all the health complications that make them vulnerable. But yet we're saying like, let's do it because we're concerned about them. And I think
and are you ever thinking, why haven't they been concerned about these children, all along?
Right,
Like,
who were doing, and so, and I was like, so how do we like, right, like pay attention to our hearts, and then dream bigger, right, like, and to ask bigger and to expect bigger. And again, this is the hope, because I feel like this, when we keep going back to normal, which was kind of messed up anyway, I was like, that actually is not like what we should be aspiring towards. We should be like envisioning something better and healthier and healing, because I feel like if we make compromises now, we're hurting our hearts, and we're going to have to sort of, again, Karen's advocating for a year of lament, because I feel like we're making a lot of decisions that are hurting people's hearts.
So, I'm gonna say that I am not sure that focusing on lament and focusing on hope aren't actually deeply connected.
Okay.
To me, they seem deeply connected. And I'll give you, so I actually wanted to mention this. We were just talking about this as we were kind of coming on live. So our church, I was in conversation with a member of our congregation whose mother-in-law died of COVID in a small Colorado town, where most of the people in the town do not believe in COVID. They believe it's a hoax. It's not clear even whether her mother-in-law completely believed as she was dying that it was COVID. And as we talked about this way that it's anonymous, 500,000 people dying. And I believe you, it's at least that much. We know because so many people died undiagnosed.
Or because they couldn't get to a hospital.
Or because
we haven't talked about all of the, and so we call it something else, right?
Yeah. So all of those lives, and no way of grieving, no way of doing in-person funerals. No, how often does an obituary in the newspaper actually say that the person died of COVID? But if you get the newspaper, you notice that suddenly our obituary pages are like pages long, right? And so our church decided, I'm just going to name her. She's perfectly in the open. This is Julie Lout, who was also on the Urbana City Council for a little bit. And I worked together to create this memorial called Open Hearts. And it's actually got this it's from a Mary Oliver poem. I'll see if I can find the quote. That is, but the idea was that we would have one heart for every person who has died in Champaign County that we know of, who've died of COVID since it began. And so we worked with Julie Pride, and we had a dedication with the chancellor of the university and the Diane Marlin and one of the city council people from Champaign City Council. And so we've got all these hearts, and then we invited people to send us names, and we are still taking names of loved ones who have died to write on the hearts, so that there's a name. There's like, and the chancellor just spoke so beautifully about how, each person here is a mother, a father, a grandfather, a daughter, a son, a whole life story, and had years of life that didn't happen. And I mean, I worry for us not having the space to do that grieving as a country.
Yeah.
And to really, because it's so anonymous, to not face, as you say, the reality that the people who've died are our elders and are people in the communities that we are already not fully valuing in the same way that we do white middle class and upper class communities. And that, this is a huge reckoning in and of itself.
Yeah.
And yet it's healing. That's what we don't understand. I'm a big fan of Joanna Macy, whose whole kind of life's work has been about, if we can face our despair, we can actually heal. And she has this idea of active hope, like not just this kind of airy fairy hope, but hope that like really looks clearly at things and totally feels what we feel in our hearts. And from that place, comes together with others to make the world that we dream of. And
I love that.
Oh yeah, it's she actually, her original work, which was in response to kind of nuclear threats, was called Despair and Empowerment. And she said, we're numb to this reality. So if we can turn towards our despair in a, not alone, but like in a supportive space, then we can be freed from that numbness to act.
Yeah.
And to act for life. I mean, it's life affirming to act for life, right? It actually helps us.
Absolutely. And it's actually one of the recommendations for helping people heal from trauma, right? Is because a trauma response people forget is numbing, right?
Right.
And hope. I love that idea of active hope as a response to, sort of as a resiliency building protective factor. And the research is right around hope is pretty compelling. We know that it helps people. It's a protective factor for suicide. It's a protective factor for addiction. It's a protective factor for people who've experienced even, awful childhood abuse. Just having the ability to believe that things can get better, that there is some higher order working things out, that that their growth is possible, that love is possible, that better is possible, and not just possible in the abstract way, but for you. And then you having some agency, believing that you can play a role in cultivating this better, loving, more connected community, makes a difference in your mental health and wellness, and a community's health and wellness. But I love the idea. I think King had a couple quotes too around, that we have to, have both hope and infinite. We have to have both infinite hope, but also face despair. He has some quotes around that. And, it was Nelson Mandela's ongoing journey, right? Where he was constantly like aware of the realities in front of him, but also constantly believing that South Africa could be better.
And I know that both of them were really influenced by Gandhi.
Yeah.
And Gandhi had this beautiful teaching around satyagraha, truth force, that when you kind of stand on the ground of love and moral courage, there's a strength that comes from that foundation that can make, facing almost anything possible. But, I think we have a crisis. I hear this, especially young adults right now, there are a lot of young adults that have lost the sense of possibility for themselves or even for the world. And we need to embrace those members of our community who are struggling in that way, and try to show, if only by example, that, even when things are hard all over the world, you can see examples of people under terrifically difficult circumstances who just say, I'm going to do what I can, for others. And that is their healing, to be able to do that.
Yes.
I did find the poem, actually.
Okay. All right.
And,
I love that. Okay, please. Yes.
I tell you this to break your heart. by which I mean only that it break open and never close again to the rest of the world.
Mm. Mm.
Yeah. So I think that's our work, to let our hearts break open, you know, to the rest of the world.
I love that.
Yeah.
And to inspire others, that it won't devastate you or limit you. It is, to quote Alice Walker, it's the only way forward, right? Is to have your heart broken and to keep kind of day to day showing up. And I also think, because right, longer conversation, and I know we're wrapping up, but part of that, our lack of intergenerational connections, but also I have this conversation with my family. Our lack of telling the truth about the stories of struggle have made it difficult for some young adults to realize how we got here, right? Because we kind of tell the Reader's Digest versions of like what the last 40, 50 years have been like around integration or women's rights or GLBT rights, right? We sort of say like there was Stonewall and then there was nothing, and there was civil rights and then there, and not the work that it took every day for us to show up in our workspaces and to negotiate boundaries and to file discrimination HR complaints and to ally together, and how from welfare rights to choose a rights. It was not a one and done. It was a every day showing up and believing that we can get better, like, and that we deserve better, and that that it is possible. And when we don't, that people see like, oh well, for those of us in our 50s or late 40s or 60s, right, like, are like, oh well, it just was, it like was that way, and not, it was a struggle, and there were challenges. And I remember Don Owens and I went to the same college. I remember going to college in Minnesota and people thought I had tails, and that was in the 80s. Like, and so like I had to, like, if in the 80s in Minnesota at a progressive liberal arts college, people thought Black people still had tails.
That's a little, that's an eye opener.
Right? Like, that's the truth about the experience. And so when my, daughter born in the 90s experiences racial microaggressions, if I tell the truth about my experience, it doesn't seem like shocking, because it's like, oh, that's not that far away. But if I miss that part of the story, and it seems like we've always lived and worked in multiracial spaces that have always been kumbaya, and there's these renegade forces out here, then that doesn't equip them for the truth about it, right? That we just sort of did it and showed up and worked together and had difficult conversations and built friendships and alliances and did it together. So I'm hoping that's the inspiration and hope.
And I'll just say, if anybody out there is listening today who does feel isolated and despairing, that there are some amazing things happening in this very community, through the township, through trauma and resiliency, through the community coalition. There are things that can inspire. And one of the things that really helped me as a young adult who was really struggling with despair was reading biographies of people. I was obsessed with the people who had fought against apartheid in South Africa. And reading their stories of courage and how they did that, white and Black, and how they were willing to put it all on the line. And that really led to my own spiritual development, because it was like, I don't know if I'm that brave, but I'd like to become like that.
No.
And so that you seek those stories and those people who can help you know that no matter what the circumstances are, there are ways of being human that can come from love and truth and courage, and that's a beautiful thing, no matter what the circumstances are and no matter what the outcome is. So I just wanted to say that.
No, I so believe in that. That's my plug for the library. I know we're wrapping up, but so I use Russian Lit. That was what got me through my darkest phase. It was me discovering that section of the library. And then I wandered to the African American studies, but that came later. But it was really Russian literature that helped me realize, like, oh, this is not, first of all, like, it wasn't just a uniquely Black experience, that, you know, poverty and oppression and feeling disconnected and, you know, systematic and structural oppression, like, oh my gosh, that happened in other places. And then that helped me be curious about the world around me. And so knowing how other people, right, knowing that you're not alone and knowing that there is hope, but looking for role models and connecting and, you know, ask a,
Netflix. I mean, the documentaries on Netflix around the people who, you know, the one that was recently came out about Stacey Abrams. Oh my God, you know, I could watch it like 100 times, right? You know, it's like, here's a woman, Georgia, we're talking about Georgia, you know, and she has made a sea change. One woman, you know, not just one woman, she had a lot of people working with her, but, you know, she was willing to like believe that it was possible. And
yes.
so we can do
Yeah,
that.
I know we're done. Right,
Yeah.
we could clearly we could continue this conversation. So and Stacy would tell you, trust yourself, right? That you don't try to be famous or brilliant or what, but just show up fully as you, because all of the gifts that you have are fully there, right? And that they're needed for the planet for a time like this. And so you were here because you have a purpose. And so she would say, like, right, that's what I loved about her story. And that's what I think you'll realize for so many amazing people is they bloom where they're planted and they just fully show up and it is appreciated. So no, thank you for the last pitch around. There are tons of ways to get involved, big and small. We want you, you're invited, get connected. And thank you so much for this conversation. It was a wonderful way of spending an hour, and hopefully we instilled a little hope, because I think it is super important for the journey ahead, and to know that I loved your connection with hope and despair, because I do think that that's the way forward. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a joy,
It was
Karen.
a joy.
Take care.
Okay.